You think you're waiting for someone to decide whether they love you or not. But what's really happening is something else. You're being placed into a calculated silence to see how much you can take before you destroy yourself. Yes, the silence is real, but it's not innocent. It's a form of manipulation, emotional control. A cold way to maintain power without saying a single word. And the cruelest part? You're helping, you're participating, you're playing along, thinking you're being mature. You believe you're giving space, that you're respecting their time, that disappearing for a few days is normal. But in the mind of the one ignoring you, it's all calculated. It's a script, and in that script you're not the main character. You're just the predictable extra, because while you send messages and wait, they measure your desperation. While you resist the urge to text but still stalk, still wait for a reaction, still reopen old chats, they watch it all, they know, they feel it, and they test. Don't be fooled. They know the power of silence. They know that an ambiguous absence hurts more than a clear no. They know that the vaguer they are, the more you'll fantasize. And the more you fantasize, the softer, the weaker, the more manipulable you become. But no one told you this because it's easier to say the other person needs time, that they're confused, that they love you but don't know how to show it. Pretty words to hide what's really happening. You're being emotionally downgraded without even noticing. And it all begins with that silent gesture, the disappearance. But you respond with hope, with faith, with patience. And yet, each day, you feel smaller. Because it's not just the absence, it's what that absence makes you feel. Small, disposable, forgotten. That's not love. It's a power strategy. And it works. You start to change your behavior, to erase yourself, to filter what you say, to hold back your presence, to try and seem less needy, less intense, more chill. But that's not emotional balance, that's fear. It's anxiety dressed up as maturity. Meanwhile, the one ignoring you realizes they've won, that your silence isn't a statement, it's submission, that your patience isn't wisdom, it's discreet desperation, that your absence doesn't demand respect. It just confirms the role they already assigned you, the one who accepts anything. You want to know if there's still a chance, if it's still worth waiting, if it was your fault. But you're asking the wrong questions. The real question is, why are you accepting a type of silence that doesn't heal you but makes you sick? Because some silences are peace, and others are emotional torture. And the worst kind is the one that makes you doubt yourself. That messes with your sense of worth. That puts you in a cycle of humiliation disguised as hope, where time passes and you're still there, frozen, waiting for someone who already read you entirely and still chose to vanish. But today, the mask falls. You'll understand that their silence was never neutrality. It was sophisticated contempt. And your silence, if used with intelligence, can be the end of this entire game. Because what they least expect is for the fool to evolve. And when the fool disappears, not out of revenge, but out of clarity, the whole game collapses. Have you ever stared at your phone like it was a silent oracle? Waiting for a message that never comes, a reply that doesn't arrive, trying to decipher the reason behind the absence, the vanishing, the silence that screams louder than any words. It hurts, and you know it. At first, you try to justify it. They must be busy. Maybe they haven't seen it yet. The mind grabs onto any excuse not to face what the heart already knows. You're being ignored, and not out of distraction, out of strategy. It's a mental game, and you've been thrown into it. It's not confusion, it's calculated disdain, measured coldness. The one ignoring you knows exactly what they're doing. The silence is a test. A test to measure how much humiliation you can take before realizing the role you've been assigned. The one who begs, the one who waits, the one who accepts emotional crumbs. Every ignored message is not an oversight. It's a move on a chessboard, and in this game, you're the disposable piece. The one that waits while the other controls the timing, the pace, the reply, or the absence of it. The strategic silence has become a weapon, and you're feeling its emotional impact. You try to be patient, to stay emotionally grounded, but inside, it's collapse. A wounded ego, anxiety burning, looping thoughts that won't stop. Because the useless waiting corrodes you. And deep down you know something's wrong, and you're right. The mistake isn't the silence. The mistake was believing that this absence had any innocence, that it was just a phase, that everything would go back to normal soon. But there is no more normal, there's a psychological game. And you're being tested. That emotional block that feels like a wall between you, it's not by accident, it's silent manipulation, a way to create artificial scarcity, to place you in the inferior position without saying a word, but making it clear, you want more than I do. The calculated absence exists for this very reason. To reverse the roles. Whoever controls the silence controls the emotional urgency of the other, and the more you try to get close, the further you move away from your own dignity, because you start accepting contempt as part of the relationship. This is not about love, it's about emotional power. And in this case, power means full control of the narrative. Whoever disappears without explanation, but leaves traces, photos, signs of life on social media, is sending a message. I can live without you, and I'll make sure you see it. But what most people don't understand is that this kind of coldness isn't accidental. It's a scripted emotional strategy, a psychological test model where silence becomes provocation, absence becomes threat, and indifference becomes emotional response. They're not confused. They're observing how far you'll go before you break, testing how much you can tolerate without reacting, measuring how far your dignity can be pushed. Because the more you tolerate, the more you accept the role of being less. And in this process, the silent suffering intensifies, because there's no fight, no explanation, just a slow, gradual vanishing that leaves space for interpretation. And in that interpretation, self-deception is born. Maybe it's just a rough patch. It's not. It's a choice, and that choice has a name: positioning. At this moment, the one ignoring you is positioning you as someone who waits, who accepts, who remains available. Even without words, the message is loud. You're not a priority. You're an option, a plan B, or worse, a distraction. When you try to confront them, you get more silence. When you insist, you find coldness, and when you pull back for a while, they return, with a late message, a random emoji, just to test if they still have control. Spoiler, they usually do, because by then, you're already emotionally involved. And here comes the painful question. Why would someone treat like this a person they claim to care about? Because it was never about feelings. It's about control, and how the game is being manipulated. The harsh truth is this: you're not being forgotten. You're being repositioned, slowed down, emotionally downgraded. Every silence, every absence, every retreat is part of an emotional domination strategy where you don't even realize you're losing. Losing time, self-worth, clarity, because you're trapped in an emotional illusion created by someone who learned to use vanishing as a tool of control. They don't want you free, they want you anxious, on edge, always waiting, always vulnerable, always available. But what happens when the one who was seen as the fool of the game decides to stop playing? When the emotional response is silence in return? When control changes hands and absence becomes a mirror? Being ignored isn't random. It's an experiment, a silent but calculated emotional test. While you try to understand the reason behind the silence, the disappearance, the absence, someone on the other side is watching. Not what you say, but how you react when you get nothing. Silence is never neutral. It's disguised provocation, a lens that magnifies your every move. If you chase, they take note. If you beg, they mark it. If you stay quiet for a while but come back, they score a point. Every reaction of yours fuels a game you didn't even know you were in. They don't need to say a word. All it takes is to disappear. Ignore. Remove their presence. Create an emotional vacuum that makes you doubt even who you are. And in that space of doubt, the traps appear. Anxiety, emotional urgency, repetitive thoughts, loss of control. The longer you wait, the more predictable you become. Because those who master the power of absence know you will give in. You'll send the first message, you'll react to a story, you'll try to reconnect even with wounded pride. They count on it. This kind of manipulation is silent but powerful. It works because there's no confrontation, no argument, just disappearance. Disappearance with intention, with purpose, to measure how much you can take before you break, to test the size of your desperation. They don't ignore you out of anger, they do it with calculation. They want to know if you're still in control of your emotions, or better, they want to take that control from you without warning. Because when your response is full of anxiety, the game changes owners. This is exactly where most people fall. They send that impulsive message, short, tense, full of expectation, as if a reply could ease the weight of the silence. But the effect is the opposite. You hand the game back to the one who vanished. And don't be fooled. That silence isn't carelessness. It's behavioral study. They know that ignoring creates emotional dependency. That calculated absence triggers old insecurities. That silent suffering messes with your most vulnerable places. It's a psychological test. And if you don't recognize it, you fall into self-deception. You start justifying, defending the one ignoring you. They must be going through something. Maybe they just need time. But no one needs time to show respect. Silence speaks, and it speaks loud. They create scarcity on purpose. Disappearing becomes strategy. Delayed response becomes weapon. And when you finally send that first message, thinking you're being mature or understanding, you don't realize you just handed over your dignity on a silver platter. Because the silence was never innocent. It was emotional provocation. And your reaction was exactly what they were waiting for. You were measured. And in being measured, you were classified, predictable, available, willing to chase, even after being ignored. The immediate emotional response reveals everything. It shows that you're still emotionally available, that your ego hasn't learned from the absence, that your emotional control is fragile, and that one disappearance is enough to throw you off balance completely. And when they realize this, the game intensifies, because now they know how much you tolerate. They know all it takes is a few days of disappearing for you to spiral. That simply not reading a message is enough to make you question what you did wrong. Then comes the late return, that vague, dry reply, as if nothing ever happened, and you accept it, because you've already been conditioned to believe that any sign is better than silence. But this is not reconnection, it's reinforcement of control. You treat the cold message like a gift, a sign of hope, but in reality it's just another test, another layer of the mind game. They don't return because they miss you. They return to see if they still have control. And most of the time, they do. The brutal truth: the moment you send the first message, you've already lost the game. Because it wasn't initiative, it was reaction. And every emotional, impulsive reaction reveals one thing: emotional hunger, dependency, fear of losing someone who's already shown you their indifference. You were silent on the outside, but in chaos inside. And that emotional urgency made you act too soon, before clarity, before understanding. And what began as their strategic silence turned into your silent humiliation. But there is something more powerful than sending a message, not sending one, not reacting, not replying. Because when silence is met with selective presence, something shifts, the balance cracks, the script fails, and the one who once held control begins to question it. But can you endure that absence without falling into the traps? Because the next move could flip the game, and the one who ignores today might be begging tomorrow. The thirst for answers starts small, just a desire to understand, to clarify, to fix things. But slowly it becomes an obsession disguised as concern, a panic masked as care. And before you know it, you're begging for attention, even if you do it gracefully. You think you're being mature by waiting, that you're practicing patience, that you're respecting the other person's time. But in reality, you're standing still, accepting indifference as normal, feeding off emotional crumbs and calling it hope. Their silence is not a neutral space, it's a control strategy, a subtle form of manipulation where the other person creates absence just to watch how you react. And the more you chase, the more predictable you become. And the more predictable, the more disposable. You think you're maintaining your dignity, but in the eyes of the one ignoring you, you're sinking. Because insisting on someone who's already shown coldness is like trying to warm a statue. You drain yourself. You frustrate yourself. And without realizing it, you place yourself beneath them emotionally. They didn't block you by accident. They froze you emotionally, cut the flow, closed off the access. And it wasn't carelessness. It was a test. to see how much you're willing to tolerate, to measure how far your desperation can go masked as loyalty. You interpret the silence as space, but for the one who's absent, that space is control. It's a command zone, a territory where the psychological game plays out, where absence isn't a pause, it's a weapon, where strategic disappearance becomes a programmed emotional response. This is where emotional submission begins. You start trying to please, justifying things, making compromises you once swore you never would. You recall conversations, remember promises, and inside, a cycle of anxiety begins to grow with every hour of pointless waiting. The game changes when you accept less than you deserve just to avoid losing someone who doesn't respect you. When you trade self-respect for scraps of attention. When your calm is really fear of causing a final break. That's not patience, it's self-abandonment. Many think they're strong for not messaging, but their thoughts are still consumed, their emotions still trapped in the silence. The emotional urgency is alive. And the most dangerous part isn't what you do, it's what you feel in silence. And at that point, the one ignoring you feels they have full emotional control of the situation, because they know you're still there, still waiting, still hoping, still clinging to the illusion that their silence is a challenge to be conquered. You think you haven't lowered yourself because you didn't beg openly, but begging with elegance is still falling. When you respond to contempt with more presence, when you try to make up for coldness with double the attention, when you accept less, hoping for more. That emotional fall isn't visible on the outside, but inside it destroys. Your self-esteem cracks, your sense of worth dims. You start thinking you need to be better to be accepted, that maybe you did something wrong, and that's how self-deception and dependency are born. You begin testing yourself, waiting 2 days to reply, avoiding liking a photo, staying off social media. But everything still revolves around them. Your actions are reactions. There's no real control, just a desperate attempt to regain the power you lost. And you know what happens when they see this, when they realize you're still available, still calculating, still waiting. They disappear even more, because they know they can. Because they know your emotional response has already been handed over, without cost, without demand. But this is where everything can change. When you understand that walking away isn't coldness, it's protection. That stopping the chase isn't pride, it's dignity. That calculated absence can also come from you. And when it comes from maturity, it doesn't hurt, it teaches. There comes a moment when silence must stop being submission and become selective presence. When you choose not to react, but to rebuild. When you stop begging for messages and start cultivating a form of respect that doesn't need anyone else to exist. And that's why, if you've made it this far, it's time to stop playing the fool. Time to stop settling for silence disguised as confusion. Time to stop giving in where there's only manipulation. Begin rebuilding your emotional presence, slowly, firmly, and with peace. This is the turning point. And if you want to continue this journey of silent strength, true detachment, and strategic emotional control, subscribe now. Because the next step isn't about winning someone back. It's about winning yourself back. But before you turn that key, there's still one thing you need to understand. What happens when you disappear by choice, and they realize they've lost control? The game is cruel, and the worst part is, you don't even know you're inside it. You think you're dealing with a romantic dilemma, but in reality you're in an emotional experiment. A simulation of presence, control, disappearance, and reaction. They ignore you methodically, calmly. They know silence is the strongest trigger. They know the more they pull away, the closer you move in. And they watch from a distance as your anxiety rises, your thoughts speed up, your heart stumbles. You type a message, read it, rewrite it, delete it, read it again, save it as a draft, rehearse it. Remember the tone you used to use. You're afraid of sounding needy, but deep down you're already begging in silence. You just don't want it to be too obvious. Then comes the second stage, reopening old chats, scrolling through screenshots, reinterpreting words, looking for signs that may have never been there, and at the same time checking the last seen, the green dot, the status that never changes. Anxiety dressed up as hope. You think you're fighting for love, but you're not. You're fighting for validation, for answers. You're trying to restore the emotional control that was ripped away without warning. And now, instead of love, what you feel is emotional urgency, and it comes with a cost. That cost is your peace, your time, your clarity. Because what was once feeling has turned into reaction. Every disappearance becomes a stimulus, every absence a test. Every tiny interaction becomes a reward. That's how the experiment works. Intermittent reinforcement. You've seen this before, you just didn't realize it. A rat in a maze presses a lever. Sometimes it gets food, sometimes it doesn't. And it's that sometimes that keeps it trying. That makes it keep pushing, keep hoping, keep begging without knowing why. You're the rat now. And the reward is a reply that never comes, a glimpse of life that gives you false hope. An old like that suddenly reappears, a silent view of your story. Small hooks dropped on purpose so you never leave the cycle. This isn't love, it's manipulation. A sophisticated yet cruel mind game. Because the person behind it doesn't care about your feelings. They're curious about your behavior, about how predictable you are, about how much they can control your response. Their silence isn't emotional absence, it's an experiment. Their disappearance isn't forgetfulness, it's a test. They want to see you moving while they stay still, to watch you collapse while they appear composed. They want you to fall apart on your own. And the most impressive part? It works. Because you still believe you're making decisions. You think you're choosing to move closer. But it's all been steered, leading you exactly where they wanted, to emotional submission disguised as effort. Have you ever found yourself checking your phone at 2 a.m., rereading old messages you once ignored, posting things just to provoke a reaction? If so, understand this isn't love. You're being trained like a lab animal. They play emotional scarcity. They create invisible emotional blocks. And you, without realizing, begin adapting your behavior, trying to unlock a connection that's already been sabotaged. But the more you try, the deeper you sink into the emotional illusion they created. And don't be fooled, they know you're trying, they just won't show it. Because that's the essence of the experiment, to observe, to test, to reinforce, to control, all without engaging directly, all in silence, so it feels natural when it's anything but. Inside that cycle, you become drained, you feel small, you begin doubting your worth, thinking maybe you need to change, improve, be better. But the problem was never you. The problem was the invisible game you were pulled into without knowing. And now comes the most powerful question of all. What happens when the experiment stops responding? When the rat realizes the lever does nothing? When silence, instead of being fed, is met with indifference? You thought that by being patient, everything would fix itself, that if you stayed calm, didn't pressure, didn't react, didn't cry, they'd see your value. But they didn't, because in this game, their absence was power, and your constant presence was emotional submission. You never had control. Not even when you told yourself you were being mature. Not even when you said, this time it'll be different. Control always belonged to the one who disappeared without warning, ignored your messages, and measured their coldness with surgical precision. And that's why when you finally choose to disappear, something shifts, not out of pride, not to provoke, but because you're emotionally exhausted, because you realize there's nothing left to say, that any word from you now would be used against you. So, you vanish. This disappearance comes without warning, no open letter, no explanation, because you've understood that silence was always the language used against you. But now you learn to use it in your favor, and that's when the game turns silently. They expected drama, a long text, a demand for answers, an emotional outburst. They expected chaos, they expected traces, but what you offer is absence, dry, cold, calculated, and that dismantles everything, because their silence was poison. But yours becomes the antidote, the bitter remedy that neutralizes all emotional manipulation, all false hope, all illusions carefully planted under the disguise of distance. You stop being the one who begs and become a selective presence, an emotional stillness that doesn't scream but silences, that doesn't confront but disappears, that doesn't accuse but leaves, and that creates the most devastating effect of all, the mirror. They look and for the first time no longer see you, There's no one waiting anymore. No unread messages, no anxious hearts, no instant replies. All that remains is emptiness. It's a strategic disappearance that hurts because it asks for nothing. It simply removes everything. Their mind spins. They try to understand why you stopped. Where did that emotional urgency go? Where is the neediness that always brought you back? They search for the chaos they expected, but find absolute silence, and that's when something breaks. Because there's nothing more terrifying for someone who thrives on emotional control than losing it. And now, you're no longer inside the experiment. You're outside the cage, and the one who used to beg for answers now ignores. The shift is subtle at first. You don't send messages, don't interact, don't try to explain. You simply disappear with dignity. And even without saying a word, you begin to reverse the entire psychological game through your absence alone. They start to miss you, but not what you used to say. They miss the power they had over you. The certainty that all it took was going silent to watch you collapse. The safety of knowing you'd always be there, emotionally available even when hurt. Now they're the anxious ones. They're the ones checking their phone constantly. They're the ones rereading old conversations, searching for signs. And this role reversal doesn't happen through shouting, it happens through silence, through vanishing, through calculated absence. And you, instead of chasing answers, start to rebuild yourself. You begin to breathe outside the emotional bubble. You realize that their absence, once so painful, no longer defines you. Because now what defines you is your own boundary. Dignity returns, self-respect grows. And emotional control, once seemingly lost, slowly comes back. You realize you don't need someone who ignores you to feel alive. That forced presence is a slow death. That ignoring can also be a form of strength. Yes, it still hurts at times, because emotional attachment doesn't vanish overnight. But the difference now is that you feel the pain in silence, not to gain attention, but to cleanse your soul, to reorganize your inner structure, to become whole again. And the most powerful part? When they finally try to reopen the door, it's too late, because you're no longer there, not physically, not emotionally, not energetically. The disappearance was final. The healing was real. And the answer is your absence. They send that "Hey stranger" text, a random emoji, a half-hearted reaction hoping you'll respond like before. But you don't, because you now understand that any response given after being disrespected is wasted energy. And what was once urgency is now lucid coldness. You've learned that the greatest emotional power isn't silence itself, it's silence rooted in awareness, in maturity, in the end of self-delusion. Because disappearing with dignity isn't revenge, it's healing, and healing in silence is priceless. The question is no longer, when will they come back? And if they do, is it even worth opening the door? The manipulator always plays for an audience. They create scenes, disappear, reappear, drop emotional bait. But none of it works unless there's someone on the other side reacting, someone who feels, who begs, who chases. Someone predictable, available, on edge. But when true absence happens, something changes. And it's not a performative absence, the kind that says, "I'll disappear just to make a point." It's a real absence, silent, serene, the kind that doesn't need an announcement, because it doesn't say goodbye, it simply leaves. You don't reply to random emojis. You don't react to provocative stories. You don't like carefully posted photos meant to catch your attention. You don't post cryptic quotes hoping they'll notice. You just disappear, in peace. And what happens on the other side? The game they built starts to collapse, because they don't know how to play alone. The absence of an audience is the manipulator's downfall. When you stop playing the fool in their story, the one pulling the strings loses the script. You were always the fuel of the spectacle. When you suffered, they won. When you begged, you fed their ego. When you gave in, you reinforced their emotional control over you. But now there's no stage, no reactions. At first, they try to hold on to control, drop a few crumbs, old likes, vague messages, a hey at 2 a.m., but you don't respond. And that indifference, once unimaginable, has now become your strongest shield. They weren't expecting this. They expected collapse. They expected anxiety. They expected to see you fall apart inside. But instead, they find serenity, A clean coldness, no poison, no revenge, just absence. And that destabilizes them more than anything else could. Because the manipulator doesn't know how to handle true silence. They're used to chaos, to tears, to a mental game where every action triggers an immediate emotional reaction. But when there's no response, all that's left is the mirror. And the mirror shows them who they really are. Because without someone to manipulate, there's no more control. Only emptiness. Only the echo of their own emotional game, now exposed, unmasked, ineffective. When you disappear, their script falls apart. You begin to feel the shift. Peace doesn't arrive all at once, but it arrives. Urgency turns into clarity. Silent pain turns into detachment. And emotional illusion gives way to self-respect. The most curious part? They keep trying. With every ignored attempt, their anxiety grows. Your coldness becomes punishment, not because you use it as a weapon, but because they no longer know where to find you. Not emotionally, not symbolically, and not understanding your absence is the internal collapse of someone who always thought they were in control. They started the game believing you'd always come back, that your presence was guaranteed, that one crumb would be enough to spark your desperation. But now everything has changed, because you've understood that absence is the most dignified response to contempt, that disappearing isn't weakness, it's protection. That silence, when used wisely, is what's left when every word has already been exhausted. They come back, they always come back. But it's not love, it's discomfort, it's fear. Because someone who always had the control now has to learn how to live without an audience. And that hurts more than rejection. It hurts the ego, it bruises the pride. They test you again, drop hooks, create situations that once would have triggered you, but you don't bite anymore. Because now, you're not the one seeking answers. The one who ignored you is the one on the edge of emotional collapse, without even understanding why. You realize the power of your absence when the one who once discarded you starts begging for your attention, not with flowers or sincere apologies, but with weak attempts to regain control, attempts that once worked, and now fall flat, because now you're no longer available. Not emotionally, not energetically, your presence is a privilege. Your attention is no longer a cheap currency. Your energy is no longer for sale. And that breaks the structure of those who once underestimated you. The phrase is simple, yet it changes everything. When you stop acting like a fool, the manipulator loses the script, because the power they once used against you now turns against them. And there's nothing more disturbing than that, realizing that the silence they once used as a tool of control has now become a sentence, that the absence which once caused you pain now gives you freedom, that the one who once pulled your strings is now dancing alone in their own void. But what happens when that absence turns into rebirth? When your disappearance isn't an escape, but a transformation? Because at the next stage, it's not enough to vanish. Now it's time to evolve. They always come back. Maybe you've noticed this. No matter how much time passes, the cycle repeats. The calculated silence gives way to a subtle message, an emoji, a memory. I just wanted to see how you're doing, but now so you're someone else. This time you don't rush to reply. Your heart doesn't race. You don't smile over a simple, hey. You read it and let it sit there, because you realize that what once had an impact no longer moves you. The urgency is gone. You're no longer the same. The one who once collapsed at their silence now wears coldness as armor, not to harm but to protect. The indifference that once shattered you now shields you, a clear sign that you've learned. You've learned that absence is also a language, that vanishing, when done with awareness, isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. You understood that you didn't need explanations from someone who ignored you. You needed strength not to go back to a place where you were treated like an option. When they return, they expect to find the same setup, the same fool, the same availability, the same hunger for attention. But what they find now is mature coldness, selective presence. Someone who no longer needs to prove anything. That casual attempt to return as if nothing happened doesn't work anymore, because you carry in your skin the memory of every ignored message. Every day you waited. Every night their ego was fed by your silent suffering. Now it's different. You don't need to scream your transformation. It's in your voice, in the delay of your response, in the indifference that once seemed impossible. They feel it, they see it, and it shakes them. Because those who control fear losing control. The game has turned, and you didn't need to cause a scene. You just stopped chasing, stopped reacting, stopped begging in silence. And that unexpected calm, that absence of desperation, is what wounds the ego of someone who thought they had you in their hands. They return, but now they're met with an invisible barrier, one built not from rage, but from clarity. You don't need to say, "I'm done." Your silence, your coldness, your lack of curiosity, say it all. Maybe they'll try to provoke you, send something that used to make you laugh, try to recreate an emotional bond from the past. But it doesn't work anymore, because the person you were back then no longer exists. The fool is gone, and in their place stands someone who knows their worth. And that's when they realize they didn't disappear on someone weak. They vanished from someone who learned how to disappear too. And that's terrifying for anyone who once had control, because now every attempt to return is a painful reminder that the game is over. You realize that the pain didn't destroy you, it shaped you. That the silence that once humiliated you now empowers you. That their absence, once unbearable, made space for your own reconstruction. And that there's no longer room for anyone who treated you with contempt. Even if they try to flip the script to make it seem like you were the one at fault, you no longer take the bait. Because once you recognize the scent of manipulation, you no longer walk into the trap. The emotional snare is now exposed, and you're free from it. They will miss you, but not exactly you. They'll miss the influence they had, the emotional effect they caused, the ease with which they could shake you, but none of that exists anymore. Because now you live differently, with inner presence. Your response, once immediate, is now silence. Your interest, once intense, is now minimal or gone. Your energy, once entirely theirs, is now channeled back to you, and that leaves them lost. They expected reactions. What they get is nothing. This isn't revenge, it's maturity. It's not pride, it's protection. You understood that being too available is what placed you in this position before, and that your healing began the moment you stopped responding on impulse. You don't chase anymore, you move forward. And for that reason, every step you take is a reminder that the game has ended. They can come back as many times as they want, but the stage, the lights, the music are gone. They return, but all they find are the ruins of what once was. Because what you rebuilt is no longer accessible to those who destroyed it. Your new world has doors and locks, and only those who understand respect are allowed in. Those who once saw you as predictable now face the mystery of your absence. The predictability that fed their control has been replaced by a calm, firm, impenetrable presence. And that breaks more than any scream ever could. You don't need to prove you've changed. Just stay calm, steady, selective. Because the peace you've earned has a high price, and you won't sell it for emotional scraps. Whoever wants to come back will find a new version of you, one that no longer negotiates dignity. And this version of you is irreversible. Enough. Enough with believing you need to improve yourself to be accepted by someone who treats you with indifference. Enough with thinking patience means erasing yourself, that love means accepting crumbs, that their silence is a puzzle you must solve. It's not. It's contempt, manipulation, control. And the more you try to understand it, the further you get from the only thing that truly matters, self-respect. You're trying to save a connection that only exists in your mind, a bond that's already been broken, but you still pretend it's whole. And while you do that, the one who's ignoring you silently watches you crumble. But it doesn't have to be this way. The answer isn't shouting, it isn't explaining yourself, it isn't begging for a return. The answer is doing the one thing they never expect: disappear with purpose. They're used to your silent desperation, your predictability, your anxious craving for any kind of response. They think you'll always give in, always come back, always chase. And that's where your power lies. Because the day you stop reacting, the game ends. The day you stop writing long messages that'll never be read, the script breaks. The day you don't reply to that passive-aggressive emoji, the control slips from their hands. The day you combine silence with indifference, they'll taste the collapse they once designed for you. Because deep down, what they fear isn't losing you. It's losing the emotional control they had over you. And when that control is gone, there's nothing left, because the whole bond was built on manipulation, scarcity, and psychological domination. And bonds like that only survive as long as the victim cooperates. But you're not in the same place anymore. Today, you understand that disappearing isn't cowardice, it's emotional protection, that ignoring isn't immaturity, it's strategy, that silence isn't weakness, it's rebuilding, and that the only true reconquest that matters is the reconquest of yourself. And now I invite you to do something simple but powerful. If any of this made sense to you, if you saw yourself in it, if it hurt but opened your eyes, then write in the comments, "I am the end of the game," not out of drama, but out of decision. Because there comes a moment when you stop being someone's emotional toy and take the board for yourself.